As for its employees' interests, this sudden thing that firms are supposed to be interested in, these remain, of course, defined by the employer. Since the choice is to work or to starve, of course it's in the workers' interests to work. But their interests are interests forced on them, just as their so-called choosing to work isn't really a choice at all, but a necessity. Workers, that's us lot, all of us, are put into a position where we can survive only by agreeing to be used merely as a means to an end, and by using ourselves in the same fashion. But the fact that a state of affairs is necessitated does not change either its moral status or its political meaning. Only the extent to which people are in a position to act in accordance with that status. The fact that someone buys an operation rather than choosing to die does not render their choice right, though it certainly renders it understandable, and in my view excusable, though that opens up the very difficult issue of the extent to which circumstances do or do not take away from moral culpability. In short, the firm effectively owns the workers' labour, and to that extent, the firm owns the workers. As the owner of a chain of lap dancing clubs recently put it, opening a new one in Brighton, when commenting on legislation requiring such clubs to apply for a sexual entertainment licence, this requirement, I quote, deprives him of his possessions. That is more than a metaphor. It's all too literal. Let's go to the second objection, the more serious one. The objection that the relations of self-love or self-interest are limited to the market. This, I think, actually was Adam Smith's view, as Amartya Sen points out. While the passage I quoted from Smith earlier is indeed the most widely quoted one in Smith, as Sen points out, I quote, "In the rest of Smith's writings, there are extensive discussions of the role of other motivations that influence human action and behaviour." But how do we understand that argument? How are we to understand the argument that the market has its limits? Either Adam Smith must think that this is what we're fundamentally like, so that the morality of the market underpins everything else, or that although this is one aspect of human experience, it's not the whole of it. And I think that the scholars who take the generous view, and I'm not an expert on Smith at all, that it's the latter that represents Smith's thinking, I think they're right. Just as the morality of the market is part of our experience, so is, for instance, disinterested altruism. Consider the righteous among nations who hid Jews from Nazi persecutions on mainland Europe during the Second World War. Both of these things have their place. As Jerry Cohen put it rather well, both selfish and generous propensities reside, after all, in almost everyone. As a description, that's fine, regardless of whether you think that these facets of our experience, or of human nature, as some might put it, are in some way given, or that they arise through social structures. But how can this be a defence of capitalism? Either the butcher's and the baker's self-love, and thus you're being treated merely as a means to an end, is confined to a particular context, to a specific game, as Wittgenstein would say, or it isn't. If it is confined to a specific game, then stepping out of such a context would put a stop to it. Being a worker or a customer is only a role that you voluntarily and temporarily take on, in which case, of course, you're not being treated merely as a means to an end, any more than spectators watching football treat the players merely as a means to their end of enjoying the game. Why? Because if somebody's injured, they immediately step out of their role as player, unless they are, and then fill in the number of names that you don't like. And in being medically treated, they cease to be treated merely as a player. But of course, that's not how things are, other than in games. Capitalism is not like football. It's not a game show. It's not a game, significantly and importantly, that we can choose to take part in or not. We cannot simply walk away from capitalism as if it were a game. It's not optional. And that's why, so far as I know, Smith never managed to explain just how, quote, other motivations that influence human action and behaviour relate to the self-love that governs market transactions. But if that's the claim, I think we're owed an explanation of how that's possible. So far as I know, Smith doesn't provide it. So far as I know, no one provides it.